Okay, the meeting is now live. So welcome to the meeting, everybody. The first item on the agenda is election of chairperson. Please, may I have nominations for the chairperson?
I'm happy to nominate Andrew Harris, Joe.
Okay, thanks, Will. Can I have a seconder?
Happy to second.
Thank you, Sarah. Any more nominations? No? Okay. Andrew, I can confirm you've been re-elected as chair for the next 2 years.
Okay,
Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay, we've got some new members joining us today, so we just welcome to them. So there's Wendy Newby, who is special school head teacher representative. Liz Oakey, also special school head teacher. Justin Godding, primary school head teacher, and Ros Nelson as an early years representative. So welcome to you, and I look forward to working with you and your contributions to our meetings. There are also some apologies today. So Councillor Stephen Davis is not able to join us. Also John Millen, who's a primary school head, David Alexander, Amanda Horniman, Karen Lewis, Alex Norman, and Elisa Entwistle. But I think Amanda PC, are you here as a substitute? Amanda?
Yes, Andrew, yes.
Excellent, brilliant. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay.
There's also apologies from Rhian Evans, Andrew.
Okay, all right, thank you. Okay, so can we move on to the minutes of the last meeting, which was held on the 12th of January, a very long time ago. So if I could just go through first of all to pick out any issues with accuracy, that'd be great. So I know it's a bit laborious, but we'll go through page by page. So first of all, page 1 in terms of the attendance and so on particularly. Okay, page 2, page 3, page 4, page 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 and 10. Okay, so what we'll now do is go through and pick out any matters arising with particular reference to the actions which are summarised on the action sheet, which is I think page 13. So going through, there's an action on page 4, which is the first item on the action sheet, which is about a dedicated schools grant. Phil, anything to report back on that one?
So on the central services block, so
yeah, the central services block,
yeah, so that's been noted, and anytime we report on that, we will provide further detail. That's going to be an ongoing activity for us now to report against.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and then there was an item about web links to the June 2022 Gloucestershire Childcare Sufficiency Duty Report. I mean, that has been emailed to members, so I think that action has been completed as far as I'm aware. Okay, and then concerning high needs, there are three actions from there. All three of them have Head of Education Strategy and Development next to them. So Phil.
Yeah, so item 2 was emailed on the 9th of Feb. For the first item, the benchmarking data on the HCPs, we have got SEND2 data now, okay, but we haven't got the full analysis yet. So the SEND2 data will enable us to update all of the national benchmarking, statistical enabled benchmarking data. So you'll notice in the high needs report, for example, we've still got some gaps in terms of the national data in our current reporting. we've just got that data, so for the September meeting, we'll make sure that data is circulated ahead of the September meeting. And then on the modelling on BAM 4, so we have adjusted the band marginally, and we're closer to balance. But the reality is, at the moment, the current modelling is showing that the new banding system is going to be marginally higher cost anyway. So that 57k was an estimated number. So we're looking at a slightly higher number, and I'll come back to that on high needs reporting.
Okay, thank you very much, Phil. Okay, were there any other matters arising that anybody wanted to raise at this stage? Okay, so can we go on to declarations of interest? Does anybody need to declare any particular interest in any agenda items for this meeting? Okay, thank you. And then I'd like to insert item 4.5, which is about some news about high needs funding. Sue, I think you're going to cover this.
Early years.
Thank you.
Yeah, early years.
Early years, I beg your pardon, sorry.
So I attended a DFE webinar yesterday on the supplementary grant, which was announced for early years last Friday, and it gave some details about that grant, which I thought I'd just update Schools Forum members. The grant isn't actually has to be agreed by Schools Forum. It's outside Schools Forum because it's not part of DSG this financial year. It's a supplementary grant on top of our existing DSG rates for early years. So the total amount nationally is 204 million. They've now issued out the increase in the rates which existing providers will get. So those increases are 33 pence for 3 and 4 year olds, and we're still checking whether that covers the working element of that 3 and 4 year olds, but we think it does. And £1.87 for 2 year olds. So those will be being added to rates. So the main thing they were trying to emphasize yesterday was we need to get this out to providers as soon as possible so they impact on the autumn and the spring terms. And they're expecting all of this money to pass through. So what we are going to do is that from September, the rates, the base rates will be updated for the 33 pence for 3 and 4 year olds and the £1.87 for 2 year olds. That will go into the base rates, and that will be paid out as normal with all the other, with the existing rates as well. The way it will work for 24-25 is that this isn't a cumulative, so we'll get a rate increase this year, and then they'll look at the rate increase for 24-25. That's likely to be then within the DSG for 24-25. Okay, so just because they wanted to get that money out as quickly as possible, they put it as a supplementary grant, so it doesn't involve any decision making. It can just be issued out. That's what will happening. The pupil premium for early years is also going up by 4 pence as well, as is the DAF. So that's going up from, I think, 228 to 881 in a full year. So it'll be a part year because clearly it's only 7/12 from September to March. So I think that just about uplines. There's also other funding coming out for LA support to increase capacity in the early years market, and they're also bringing out some what they're calling development projects for wraparound care, and that will come out to a number of local authorities to develop that. That just summarises where I think. I don't know if there's any questions from anybody on that.
Sue, can you just remind us, if you've got it to hand, what the base rates are to which those increases are being added?
No, I haven't. I should have got that, but it's
sorry.
I can tell you that the current rates you want to know. Yeah, the current Gloucestershire rates. So the current rate for 2 year olds is £5.28 for 2 year olds, and it's £4.24 for 3 and 4 year olds.
Yeah, sounds about right. Yeah.
So for
So that's
2-year-olds,
the
quite
base
quite a
rate,
big
isn't it,
percentage
Ros?
increase.
Sorry, Susan.
Ros, that's the base rate that you're quoting there, isn't it? It's not the actual Gloucestershire rate, I think, because they're two different things. I can find you the rates, most probably.
Oh, I think I've got the Gloucestershire rate.
Yeah, so it's slightly different. So what happens is for 3 and 4-year-olds is there's a rate for Gloucestershire, of which part of that is held centrally, about 20 pence.
Okay, yeah.
Then about 4 or 5 pence goes to deprivation, and the rest goes into a base rate. So we just need to be mindful of that. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
But I'll get those base rates for you, Andrew, and we'll make sure that they're in the minutes.
Okay, Mikey, did you have a question? Mikey?
Yeah, I do have. Hi, Sue. Thanks for the information.
Hi.
So yeah, the 204 million you said, is that the allocation coming to Gloucestershire, or is it just the national one? And
that's
go ahead.
That's just the national one. So yeah, we won't be getting anywhere like that because we only get about 36 million as it is for for early years. So that we'll get a proportion of that based. So they're basing it on the census in January 23, and it will be updated as they always do for the census in January 24. So it's the normal rates. They've based the calculation on exactly the same basis that they calculate the DSG. So there's no difference in the allocations on the calculation of that. It's just they wanted to get the grant out quickly, and they're using this supplementary grant to do that.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's why my second question: how you now worked out the base rate?
Sorry, I couldn't. Sorry, can you say that again, Mikey?
Sorry, yeah. So I was asking, if we don't know the quota we are getting per area, how then do we know it's going to be 33% the base rate, or was that for every nationally in comparison?
No, what they've publicised is a table with the increase in the rates for every local authority. So we know, based on the census, we will get an additional 33 pence in that grant for that. So that's why we can quote that, and that's why we can allocate it out.
Thank you. That's fine. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions at all? Okay, thank you very much. Moving on to item 5. Joe, do we have any public questions?
No, none received.
Okay, thank you. So can we now move on to item 6, which is the outturn and maintain school balances? It's a combination of Neil, Sue and Phil.
Yeah, I think it's me kicking off. I'm going to share my screen. Right, okay. So in terms of outturn, in the report, what we've provided is a picture of the dedicated schools grant outturn for 22-23, a picture of maintained school balances and the position around, and the health, I guess, around the financial position of maintained schools. Obviously we can only do it for maintained schools, we just can't get a picture for the full system, but the picture of maintained schools does give a view of kind of how the system is performing financially, albeit in the secondary landscape that's a slightly more limited with a small number of schools. And then there was a view of the children's services outturn as well, so the county council's internal budget for children's services. So we start off with the DSG, the dedicated schools grant. So this is where we finished up in 22-23. What we tried to do in the table is just give a view compared to 21-22. Ultimately, what we're saying at the moment is that our reported overspend in the DSG is 28.584 million, which is 5.19% of the gross budget. As most members will be aware, but for new members, the dominant, well, the full element of that deficit is a high needs deficit, and actually that 28.58 doesn't give the full picture because it's offset slightly by some balances. So we're currently holding in the schools block a balance of 143k against dedelegated funding, and in the early years block we've got a carried forward balance of 500,000 from 21-22 and a 22-23 year balance of 926,000. So total surplus held in the early years block of 1.426 million. Those two figures will be held against those blocks. They won't be offset, so they will be carried over. In effect, what that means is the operating, if you like, the deficit that we're really working with is 30.152 million. So the 28.58 is being slightly offset by those two balances. I can see Sarah's put her hand up. Sarah.
Just a very quick question. Union facilities is very conveniently 0.000. Can you explain that? Because I can't imagine we've hit it absolutely the nail on the head.
The reporting assumption has been that money has been fully spent. We weren't expecting to claw anything back or hold anything back against it, so that's why that's been set in a balance.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah. As you can see, there are small balances in a number of the de-delegated areas, but those will be rolled into and support next year. Like I say, not to offset any of the full deficit. So that is the kind of picture around DSG. I don't know whether anybody has any other questions around it. Obviously, the big ticket item is high needs, and there's a full agenda item around high needs. So I wasn't proposing to go through that one in detail right now. You'll have seen in the pack that the high needs deficit in 22-23 was just over £10 million, and we're forecasting for 23-24 for that to be even higher. And it is that overall, in terms of our reporting against the DSG, it is the overriding and remaining concern in terms of the viability of the grant itself. So I'm going to pause there. I don't know whether there's any questions around the dedicated schools grant without turn. No? Okay. In terms of the balances around maintained schools, so again, we've provided more detail in the pack. The picture we've got at the moment is that the total maintained school balance has increased by just over £3 million. The revenue part of that is 1.548 million. And so that's a revenue increase. The rest is capital, so 1.957, and there's been a removal of 404,000 due to academy conversions. We're currently operating with 164 schools in surplus and 23 in deficit. That's an increase of 4 compared to 21-22. So there's 4 more schools in deficit this year and than there was previously. That's despite a number of the schools that were in deficit coming out. What you can see from the kind of information, I'll just go to primary is obviously our primary is our primary area of concern. Primary is the biggest area of concern in terms of the viability of the budgets at the moment. The primary schools are incredibly stretched numbers this year. Actually, in 22-23 there was a reduction, as you can see, in the revenue balances in primary, down 74,937. Secondary moved up quite significantly, but that was a number of schools recovering what were either close to or very near deficit positions. So there was good progress in kind of redressing some issues around secondary. In secondaries at the moment, there's only obviously 5 secondary schools there, but the balances are relatively healthy in secondary at the moment. And obviously you can see there in the special schools, there's been a quite significant reduction as well, 294,000, so a reduction in balances in special schools as well. A big chunk of that is one school that was holding a quite large surplus for a specific project they were running. So overall, the health of the special schools is okay, but you can see we do have from the report, there are 2 schools that are reporting a deficit there. Alternative provision, as we're moving towards one school, and this will open in September, we have redressed the situation with a significant deficit in one of the schools, which is why that's increased significantly, but there still will be a kind of carried forward deficit as the new school opens, which we're looking to redress in September again this year. So overall, the picture is very tight. I think looking forward, and we didn't have this information at the time of writing the report. We've had the governor budget plans in, and you'll see on the final bullet on the right hand side there. At the moment, the 3-year plans we've got from maintained schools show 112 schools forecasting a deficit by 25-26. So the initial 3-year plans are showing 112 of the current maintained schools reporting a deficit of varying size or scale. And I think part of that is obviously the pressures we're seeing in the system. I don't need to tell you guys, you are on the coalface of it. But there is also an element of kind of not knowing. There was, I think, an informal conversation prior to this about pay awards. We still don't know what pay awards are going to look like, so estimates around that are challenging. And obviously we are still working on an income basis on a year-on-year budget allocation. So at the moment we don't know what 24-25 budgets will look like. We don't know what the increase in funding is going to look like. We have historically had 2 or 3 year funding plans, which have helped kind of give some visibility. At the moment, we're working year on year. So it is hard looking forward, that those kind of messages about the number of schools forecasting a deficit. It is hard to set clear budgets, because we still don't know what pay awards are going to look like, and we still don't know what income is going to look like. But based on assumptions, and certainly around income, what we've assumed is that the progression in funding for maintained schools would be similar to what we've seen over the last few years. So there has been a kind of progression and increase in funding over the last few years. We're still forecasting that to continue. So even if we continue to see funding at the current rates, at the moment the schools are reporting, 112 of them are, that they would be in deficit by 25-26. So it is a really kind of looking forward, a really challenging picture, I think. Mikey, I can see you've had your hand up. Sorry.
Yeah, Phil, no worries. No, it's good. Thanks for the explanation, because later part of the explanation, you kind of answer part of the question, because you said your statistics are based on the year-on-year calculation, which actually is quite difficult. Looking at the data, if you look at the negative 74,000 for primary, it would be good to reference it back to a year, because what we've just had a picture is only of one change, and a previous change before that change could give us a better idea and understanding of the geographical flow of the issue, because we cannot jump now and say, well, 2022 to 23 is 74,000, that's how bad it is, and then work on that. However, certain things during COVID could have affected these statistics. So would you have a record of the previous one, just maybe before COVID or before 2022?
I can certainly tell you what 20, if you bear with me. I don't know whether there are any other questions whilst I'm looking, but I've got 20. I can look at last year's report certainly for you. Are there any other questions or comments? I'd be really keen to kind of hear from any of the heads as to whether particularly academies, because obviously this is a maintained school picture. It'd be really interesting to understand whether this is how the academy system is feeling as well, in terms of that kind of onward pressure. Because Liz has put her hand up.
Liz has got a hand up.
Yeah, I did. It wasn't in relation to that, Phil, but I'll ask it first now. But I'll just go with yes in terms of the pressure and budgets going forward. Exactly the same place. It was only, my query is around the alternative provision, because the new special school that's opening, I believe, is MALD. I'm assuming, because you'll be able to give me more information on this, the children in alternative provision may not have that as their specific need. So I was wondering if has that been mapped that will have a positive impact, or actually is it not going to be necessarily the same children anyway? I was thinking if they're not MALD, it won't necessarily make any difference to the ALP.
Sorry, can you say that again? I missed part of that question.
We were just talking about the alternative provision.
Yeah.
And the opening of the new special school in September.
Yeah.
So the new special school is MALD, isn't it? Moderate and additional learning difficulties.
That's right, yeah.
I wondered, does that map with the children who are accessing alternative provision?
It doesn't really, if I'm honest. I think the provision we're putting in place for special school is already oversubscribed, yeah. And AP is already under pressure numbers as well. So I think at the moment I think it's generally kind of known that the specialist provision in the county isn't sufficient enough. We did bid for 2 free schools on that basis to try and get 400 places in. And so we'll come back to that a little bit again on the high needs budget, I guess. But yeah, there isn't too much crossover there, I don't think. Mikey, I was just going to say, in last year, what we reported in terms of maintained schools, the revenue balance increases were 3.3 million last year, so quite significantly better last year. So that was 17.8% increase. That was just the revenue elements. The capital increases were actually, to be fair, capital balances were much lower, 84,000, but the revenue was quite significantly better last year. So this year has definitely seen a tighter squeeze. But I take the point about the reporting, and we will look and maybe report multiple years next time we do this, if that's okay.
No worries, no thanks. Yeah, cool.
Just one thing on that, the full report itself does detail average balances. And those average balances do show both 22.3 and the previous year's average. So hopefully that gives some of the indication and a comparison to the previous year.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. And we did include a table in here just to show the kind of the scale of the different balances and deficits. You can see the kind of minimum balance there in primary is 164k, so that's the highest deficit. There is a primary school with a current surplus of 791,000, and we will be, as part of our work on financial oversight, we'll be writing to them as well to ask how that funding is intended to be used, because that's quite a significant surplus to retain. And as you can see in the secondary, like I said, it's much healthier. We do have one special school that we're working with quite intensively to address, and we think we have a plan there now that's working and moving forward, but remains very tight, and as you can see, quite a significant deficit. And an AP, we are resolving that by September, as I pointed out earlier. That will be resolved as part of the September transition. So that's kind of the broad picture around maintaining school budgets. We definitely see it as very challenging. I don't know about the kind of academy system. I don't know whether there are any academy heads or chairs that would kind of be able to say whether this kind of picture in maintain is reflected within the academy sector. I know that Liz, from a special school perspective, did, but I don't know whether any of the primary or secondary colleagues have a view as to whether this is kind of what you're seeing in the academy sector, or whether this is kind of slightly more unique to maintained.
I think it's fairly typical, Phil. We're finding it harder and harder every year now, and we've got an in-year deficit next year. We'll hopefully sort it out through the year, but it just is getting tighter and tighter, with staffing costs, utility costs, and everything else going up, and budgets and incomes not meeting it. Some of the slides sent earlier about, you know, if we could just get the average per pupil funding, we'd all be laughing, wouldn't we? But we're not asking for more than that, but we're so far off that it can't carry on like this.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I'm really sorry. I can't remember your name. The head teacher of Hartpury.
Hi, it's Stephen here. So obviously
I'm so sorry.
The 5 schools that I look after, budgets are definitely tighter. I think the unknowns are very difficult to plan for, and so we are looking at additional revenue streams to help us. So yeah, the challenges I think are the same.
Okay, thank you. Chiquita.
I'd agree with Will and with Phil, actually, that we're seeing exactly the same pattern across our schools. We've been particularly hit in terms of our 3-year budget forecasts by the unfunded pay awards and the increased costs. It's making forward planning incredibly difficult, and we're having to look very closely at efficiencies that we can make. And as I think Will said before the meeting started, we're between a rock and a hard place, really, because we're at that point where we have worked out so many efficiencies that actually we're now at the point where the choices that we've got left are going to impact on children and young people. And morally, that is really difficult. So it's really important that our concerns are shared more widely, to make sure that we can have something better in the system that is more equitable. So entirely agree with Will about a national funding formula for children.
Okay, thank you very much.
Andrew will probably come back to both of those issues around fairer funding and stuff later. We included some stuff from the F40, but that is definitely an ongoing issue. In terms of progressing on, and so I'll hand over to Sue around the children and families outturn. Sue, do you want to comment on this one?
That's fine. So so this is the outturn position as at the end of March for the year 22-23, as it says, and a significant overspend, which we were alluding to throughout last year, with a major variance against our external placement budgets. Part of that was affected by COVID, and we did get COVID grant to offset some of that. But the underlying overspend is over 12 million. And really, as we're looking into this year, those pressures are still with us, mainly in our residential settings, supported living, and some of our post-18 costs, where it's been really challenging to move young people onto more appropriate accommodation for when they reach the age of 18 and the support that they need. A lot of this is the national market and a real lack of supply, affordable supply for placements, which means that some of our providers have been charging very high costs, and it's very difficult when you need a placement, particularly on a Friday, not to accept those placements. We are now looking at all this, and it's being really looked at as with a review team in this financial year. But at the end of last year, as you can see, the budget was overspent by nearly 40%. The other areas really pale into significant, but are still significant. So children with disabilities, similar, we have a number of really complex young people that need high packages of care to support them. So we overspent by over 2 million. The home to school transport budget, at one point, I think we were forecasting nearer 1.5 million over. That did come down towards the end of the financial year, but was mainly driven, as it says, by increased entitlement for SEND transport and the costs of doing that, and particularly because the market, what we were finding is many providers were cancelling their contracts. We were putting them out to tender. They were rebidding for them and coming up to over 50% higher costs. So again, that indicates the lack of competition in the market and the problem we're having there. So one of the things we picked up towards the end of the year was the number of unaccompanied asylum seekers. And because our unit costs are much higher than the grant we get back from the DFE, or the Home Office, I think it is, that means that we're paying over and above the cost that we would expect to pay, particularly when you get beyond the cost, the age of 18. I think the price is about 240, something in that vein, per week, whereas some of our placements are near £1,000 a week. So you can see where the cost pressures are rising in that area as well. And finally, just some other variances picked up: Section 17 and discretionary payments for foster care children, 754k. Legal costs connected to the number of cases going through the courts, 618, and then commissioning sport, which is about all the activity that we're trying to develop, which means, and some of the costs of that, which means that came into nearly £1 million over. So those are just a brief summary of the main overspends in the children and families outturn for 22-23. Any
Okay, thank you.
questions from anybody? No. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Sue. And there's nothing else from the annex that needs to be picked out, is there? Or is there? No. Okay. So can we move on to agenda item 7, therefore, which is the high needs report.
Yes, right. So having focused backwards on the outturns for last year, looking forward now on high needs. I haven't actually included the budget layout on a slide because I don't think you'd be able to see it. You should all have it in your packs. But in essence, what we're showing this year for 23-24 is an expenditure of just over 105 million, which is set against a budget, the grant receipt of 93 million. So we're forecasting a 12.8 million overspend this year based on what we know is happening in the system, and the number of plans that are coming through, which we'll come to again in a minute. What we've done in kind of modelling the budget, and I think for those that haven't been involved in Forum for a while, one of the things we've been trying really hard to do is make sure that the forecasting that we're presenting is as accurate as it possibly can be. Now, last year we set out hoping to, it sounds like an odd statement, hoping to overspend by just under £5 million, which was the target at the start of the year. And as I said earlier, we came in just over £10 million overspent. So that was quite a significant variance to what we'd forecast. The reason for that was because we saw quite a significant step change in the number of EHCPs coming through the system. We had for some time seen a kind of progression of net increases of about 350 plans a year, and our modelling forecasting forward had been using those kind of historic trends. So we've been looking back over a 3-year period in effect and saying kind of what does the aggregate of that look like in terms of growth numbers, and actually how can we forecast that forward. That didn't work for last year because the progression was quite significant in terms of numbers coming through the system. So we saw quite a significant change. What we've done this year is we've dropped the 3-year view and used the 22-23 growth numbers as a basis on which to model 23-24. So we're assuming that this year will reflect a similar progression to what we saw in 22-23. Which is getting us to that kind of 12 million. So the first kind of key assumption there is that growth numbers are modelled just solely on the 22-23 numbers rather than a kind of broader, longer term historic trend. Mostly because that will water it down, and I don't believe that'll get us close to where we're likely to turn out. At the last meeting, we discussed the kind of 1 in 40, 1 in 30 changes. I have subsequently been to the heads associations, both the heads association, mainstream heads associations, to talk through the council decision to stick with the 1 in 30 model and keep the protection in place as we outlined at the last meeting. I know that the support from members was to stay at 1 in 40, but the additional cost of that would have placed another £2 million at least on top of what is a £12.8 million deficit now, so it would have pushed us close to 15 million pounds, and just not sustainable. So that decision to reduce to 1 in 30 was made. The special school places, and you'll notice this in the budget, special school places and top-ups have increased based on that's just based purely on the planned growth. So we're expecting to increase by 71 places this year. That is the continued expansion of Brook and the new school that was mentioned earlier by Liz. So we've got more places coming into the system, therefore the cost there will rise. That will slightly offset the independent budget, is the hope. And there is a kind of small offset into the independent placements budget as a consequence of those special school places going in. The other assumptions in there, all the specialist budgets, including AP and hospital ed, have been uplifted by the 3.4% that was outlined for the supplementary grant, or the additional grant that was provided by the DFE. So those are in the budget. Our joint funded numbers are actually reduced. So these are joint funded, high cost independent placements. So we've got a number of levers this year, and actually the downside to the high cost joint funded placements is when they come in, they can skew the budget quite significantly when they start. But actually, we've got a few levers this year, so actually there's a reduction there. But overall, the independent budget is looking to increase by something like 1.3 million this year, and that will broadly be because we don't have enough specialist placements in the maintained specialist part of the system to be able to support the number of plans coming through, a number of children that need specialist placements. So we're expecting independent to rise somewhere around about 1.3 million. We have included within that a 5% inflationary uplift, and that's broadly assumed. The challenge we have, and when we've been asked by providers for an uplift this year, we have written back to them all to say that the base increase for all specialist provision in the dedicated schools grant was 3.4%, and that's what we would advocate and want them to apply for independent placements. Unfortunately, there is much less control over how we can manage that in the independent sector. And it's very much like as Sue was identifying earlier, when there isn't enough competition or there is high demand for these independent placements, we have to pay the fees that are being charged in effect. At the moment, we're seeing most of the providers working with us to look at a kind of around about 5-6%. We have had one request for a 12% uplift, which we're negotiating downwards because that's unsustainable. And then within the budget, we've also increased any of the staffing budgets which support LA staff, so advisory teachers, inclusion, etc. Those have had a 2% inflationary uplift included, all of which brings us to that kind of picture of a 12.8 million overspend, which will take the deficit significantly over 40 million moving forward, and that is obviously a significant concern. I guess we'll come back to that a little bit more when we go through the delivering better value work, because I think that's probably the place to have a discussion about kind of next steps around this and what action we're able to take. I would be interested if there are any specific questions around what I've kind of just said there, or anything that was in the report around the actual budget itself. Any questions, comments? If not, the only other thing I've included in there, which I kind of wanted to flag, was we talked a little bit about some of the key performance indicators last year, and this is taken from the financial modelling. In effect, this is looking at, and again, we'll come back to these kind of things when we're looking at the delivering better value work. But what we're looking at here is the average cost of a placement in the specific parts of the system, and what they cost in 22-23, and what we're forecasting them to cost in 23-24. And then we've got the percentage of children accessing different parts of the system. So the percentage of children with EHCPs that are attending mainstream, they're attending special schools, etc. So in effect, those are kind of key drivers in understanding how, as we get the kind of growth in EHCPs, how they're likely to flow out into the system and affect the funding model. So included that for reference, and it is something we'll continue to keep coming back to assess how the 23-24 budget, as we go through the year and forecast against it, how it's performing against these kind of key metrics. Any questions or comments at this point? If not, I can keep going. As we've touched on, and we'll report against this each time, EHCP growth is our primary driver behind spend. The number of plans is continuing to rise. What you'll see, and I won't keep referencing forward to the DFE, what you DBV stuff, what you'll see and have seen in the pack around the delivering better value work is that actually the data we're reporting here and the kind of message back from the DBV team is that actually, whilst our EHCP numbers are significantly rising, we are still lower than our statistical neighbours and lower than the national data around the number of EHCPs in the system. So whilst we're seeing this growth, our numbers we're not an outlier by any stretch. In fact, we're behind the kind of not that we're chasing them, but we're behind the national statistical data. Obviously, we'll get an update from the SEN2 data, which I mentioned earlier. That will come through for September reporting. So overall, the numbers, whilst they are continuing to rise, are within what we're seeing in the national system. They are the key driver behind the overall spend. I included in the report because I think it's just important to keep coming back to the fact that we're not very well funded. And actually, when we're talking about an overspend each year, it's relevant to kind of look at it not just from an expenditure perspective, but also how much money we're receiving. And I've done some data around this, and I will share an F40 analysis as well towards the end of the session today. But the data, in looking at it from the data that I've produced, effectively what we've got on this slide here is an average high needs funding per pupil in the county. So if you take the number of pupils accessing statutory education within the county and distribute the high needs block funding across that kind of total pupil population, you can see where we come out on the far left there in terms of the per high needs funding per pupil, £939 per pupil, compared to a median of 1,088. And I will say I've excluded London from this analysis because obviously London does skew the median if you incorporate those the cost of living, etc., into that. So that puts us 14th of the 118 local authorities that we use for that analysis. And actually, if we're funded at the median level, we would be receiving 107.8 million, which, when you look back at what we're planning to spend this year, would mean that we wouldn't have a deficit this year. In fact, we would have a small and healthy surplus, and we could be discussing what we'd be doing with it. But you know, it is a key factor. The other way we've looked at this is actually, if you, rather than just taking the total per pupil population, actually looking at it by SEN pupil. So those that are identified as having either an EHCP or SEN support. And again, here you can see, in fact, on this metric, we're slightly worse off. We're 11th of the 118 authorities that are in the analysis. And again, we would be at 112.8 million if we were funded at the median level that's being received across the country. So it doesn't provide any solace in the fact that we've got a significant deficit, that we're underfunded, but I think it is relevant to keep raising the fact that actually we are in this position where we're not receiving an equitable level of high needs funding. I can see demonstrated hands, so I'll stop and allow Demo. Do you want to come up with your question?
Hi Phil, thanks. Just I'm wondering, how is the level of funding calculated? What's the formula for it, or the metric for it, for us to be so much lower than the median? So what I can do as an action is provide a detailed link to the detailed metric, but you know, the crux of it is that 50% of the formula is based on historic spend. So when the current dedicated schools grant was formed back in 2017, a picture was taken effectively of how each local authority was using their funding, and the schools block and the high needs block, central services and early years blocks were all created. The dependency between the high needs and the schools block was broadly, if you were a local authority that had spent or invested more in specialist provision, and you have more special schools, more alternative provision, etc., you would have had a higher high needs block at the point of formation. So 50% is still based on that position, where a local authority, if they had a higher level of specialist provision and were spending more in the kind of pure SEN landscape at that point, rather than investing in mainstream inclusion, where the funding would have gone towards the schools block,
in effect, you've got that locked in equity from 2017, which is why I know I always keep coming back to Buckinghamshire as a comparison, but they are now £31 million a year greater funded than us. Their pupil population is lower. They've got 10,000 less pupils. I think it was 18 months ago, 2 years ago, when I started talking about this, they were 27 million a year higher funded than us. Because that inequity is still there, every time more money's put in, that gap increases. It is also worth noting that Buckinghamshire are in the Delivering Better Value and Send programme, so they also have a deficit in the high needs block. So even though they are receiving 31 million a year more than us, actually they still are in a deficit. So it's that part of the formula that's a concern. The only other thing I would say about it, which is I think important, is that there was intended to be a review of the funding formula. And I guess the way you'd look at this over the period of time since the DSG was created, the schools block has seen quite a lot of change because the national funding formula has been introduced. There's been a kind of an attempt to level out. It's not got there, but it's been attempted over a period of time to try and level out and move towards that kind of national funding formula. Nothing has really kind of progressed on the high needs side. There was a plan 18 months ago to have a review of the high needs funding formula and the way it operated, but that was paused and as part of the Send and AP improvement plan, and is now being linked to that in effect. So the government, for the funding policy team and the DfE, have said that any high needs funding review will be linked to the Send and AP improvement plan, which means we're unlikely to see any real change on that for 12 to 18 months, I would think.
And the other 50%, how's that
metric? So those are based on demographics. There's a hospital education. Yeah, there's elements of that in there. There is
SEN need. SEN need.
I'm looking at Neil now. Or I'm not looking at him, I'm looking at the screen. You can't tell I'm looking at him, but Neil.
Yeah, there's a whole mixture. Some is based on bad health, on general population, IDACI, special school census numbers. As Phil said, 50% of the 2017-18 position. I think there's a couple of other bits related to AP and hospital. And that's probably the majority of it. We could easily attach a link to how it's actually calculated in the minutes, if you like, because it's a publicly available document from the DfE.
I think this. Oh, go on. Sorry, damn it.
Sorry, Phil. Carry on.
No, I was going to say one of the things we're looking at with the F40 group, and again, we'll come on to this later, is modelling an alternative. So one of the things the F40 have done historically around the schools national funding formula is provided an alternative funding formula to which they've advocated for. We haven't got to it yet, and it's not made a significant difference in terms of policy yet, but there is a really clear message. This is what we think the formula should look like. So F40 are currently working on something around SEN to look at the high needs formula and say, you know, yes, the current formula may not work. Actually, what would a formula look like? The reality and the hard part behind all of this is obviously with Buckinghamshire, and I've used them as an example. I'm not having a dig at them, just for balance. But I've used them as an example. They are also in deficit. So actually, when the government looks at this, you can't escape the fact there is a massive quantum of funding issue here. It's not just going to be about kind of reformatting, reviewing the formula and kind of redistribution. There is a significant quantum issue.
So, given the minutes of the last meeting, just looking at, you know, the overall feeling on reducing from the 1 in 40 to 130, you know, it was significant, but I know that there was no sway from, you know, the forum can't sway the decision by the local authority. But it's quite interesting just to hear how the formulas come about. I just wonder whether the local authority has done comparisons on how those 250s are split. So anyone that may be in a surplus, okay, on high needs funding, what's their demographic or situation like? Because I'm conscious of funding withering, and it's not really based on what the needs are. I think from a forum perspective, or from my perspective, I think, you know, that's what needs to be looked at. So when it comes to that 50% of the funding looked at IDACI deprivation, or that okay, I think that would be a sway. Then I suppose the other 50 then is for us as a local authority to think, well, okay, there's an element where we're in control of there to look at, okay, what we're investing in, what we're doing for high needs, etc., and making the case, I would have thought, for you know, backing up more money, because we're looking to tackle the needs that are required.
I'd need. Do you want to say a little bit more about that? So in terms of investing, I mean, at the moment, when we start this financial year, we will have spent literally our entire budget before we started. So the idea of investing it anywhere is going to be quite. I mean, we would be talking about, you know, I guess.
Phil, didn't you say that areas got more funding depending on what they did spend?
Yeah, but based on 2017 data, we can't change that. We can't change that now. Well, that's locked. That's locked in.
That's locked. Oh, I see.
Yeah,
so it's not like reviewed ongoing. It's locked at 2017.
It's locked in at 2017, and that's why we are really stuck around how we, you know, if you had a crystal ball in 2017, as somebody said this to me yesterday at the F40 group, as the finance officer, they said they would have just moved all their funding across to the high needs side, and they'd have got a massive increase. And it is a really unfortunate element of the way the formula has been created, and the reason we're pushing to try and get them to change it.
Changed. Thank you. Thanks for clarifying that. Thank you.
So that's the kind of funding levels. This is all kind of leading towards a point at the end of this where I'm going to try and kind of summarize a little bit about where I think we are and what the kind of next steps around this are. As many of you will know, we've been involved in the Delivering Better Value in SEND programme. So we are one of 55 local authorities that were invited to be part of the Delivering Better Value in SEND programme. This is one of the programmes that the DFE is operating to try and support local authorities who had an increasing high needs block deficit. The other programme that sits alongside it, for reference, is the Safety Valve programme, of which there are 34 local authorities involved. And that is for the local authorities with more significant deficits, either as a proportion of their, so it might not be financially, like in terms of a cash amount higher than us, but actually in terms of proportion of their budget would be significantly high. I think South Gloucestershire is one of those, but also those with really significantly high deficits. So there are LAs that are over 150 million in deficit as we speak right now. One who I was speaking to yesterday who had an in-year deficit last year of 38 million pounds. So those are in the kind of Safety Valve programme. We've been in this Delivering Better Value programme. It was commissioned by the DFE, but it's been run by a management consultancy organisation called Newton, who work with local government and central government around a range of improvement initiatives. And they've been really, really good. They've worked with us in a really kind of quite sensitive way, I would say. They haven't come in and suggested that they've got solutions to everything. They've worked in the system to understand what's going on here, to understand what our current plans are, and to get their head around where we are locally, and to support us in kind of making any decisions that we might need to make to try and address this situation. These were on the screen with some of the kind of key messages they were giving us. In effect, this was the kind of short-term help. This DBV and the Safety Valve programme intended by the DFE to be the kind of short-term help programmes for local authorities that are currently struggling. As part of this work, they were also looking to build this kind of objective evidence base around longer-term policy change. And I think to some extent, that's been the most useful part of this exercise, is that we are now part of an evidence base of 54 other local authorities, although they're starting to find a wave right now, but there will be an evidence base of 54 local authorities that are kind of that have been through a structured, consistent program that kind of gives a view of what the challenges are in the local system. Basically, the structure of the program has been, we had an evaluation set up at the start of the year. Initially, they were looking at baselines and forecasts. They're looking at a lot of our data. We had to produce the largest data set I've ever seen from our data hub. That was provided in, so that was the EHCP core data. And we've had to produce all of our financial modelling and submit that as part of that kind of baseline of forecasting. So in effect, allowing them to do a deep dive into all of our data and financial information to kind of assess where they think our baselines were. And then we went into a kind of module where we were looking at root cause diagnostics, in effect, looking at the data and trying to understand what was happening in the local system and where there might be opportunities to affect change that might have an impact, both in terms of financial impact, but also they were really conscious, and this is when I say they were sensitive around this approach, really conscious to always say this is rooted back in children and young people as well. This isn't about just cutting money, it's about making sure the services are good quality. And then there is an implementation and planning stage and a grant application bit, which we're kind of in at the moment. Mikey, I can see you've popped your hand up. Have you got a question you wanted to ask now? Or is it...
Yeah, it's just a quick one because it was good. You brought in one of the members for that Delivering Better Value team, and last meeting was good. And I did ask him a question. Quote me if I'm wrong. I think he said for us to enroll into being one of the 55, there is a fund, like a catch fund that goes to us. I haven't seen it being mentioned, or am I wrong to think that there is a fund we get for enrolling to this program?
There's an application form we've got to complete, but we'll be able to do that in the next, it's got to be in by the 1st of August. We've got a process to kind of start to complete that, as that's ongoing now. So we will be submitting an application into it, yeah. Right. I've tried to, in the report, I tried to pull out some of the program itself was quite intense. There's a slide deck of about 96 slides of all various different elements of the analysis and the work they went through with us. What I tried to do in the kind of a report is to kind of summarize some of the core outputs from the two kind of core modules that we've been through. I am at some stage more than happy to kind of share a fuller data set around that once it's been finalised and completed, if members think that would be useful. Out of context, the slides in themselves might not always make a lot of sense. So it's possible that we could get, if members felt it was useful, we could get Newton to come and do a kind of final wrap-up presentation to for members to give a view of what they found, if you would find that useful. But I tried to pull out some of the core information, and I guess it comes back to some of the things we've already been saying about local system. And I do think one of the reassurances that we found in this process is that there is a recognition that we did know ourselves quite well in terms of going into this from the start. Their kind of starting metric was around the EHCP numbers, and they've used a different approach to us. But what you can see there is that we're on the right hand side. Actually, our numbers of EHCPs are actually pretty low compared to the kind of national statistical neighbours. This is showing it against the kind of LA average for 22, and then an upper quartile of that. So at this point, we know our EHCP numbers are lower. This was useful context because we don't necessarily get this data very easily. That actually Gloucestershire in the main, the number of children and young people with EHCPs accessing mainstream is quite high. It's just the idea of focusing around mainstream inclusion. Actually, the numbers of children with EHCPs that are in mainstream in Gloucestershire at the moment is relatively high, and that's actually just been on a progressive, albeit small, progressive increase over the last 3 years. They looked at a lot of detail at our kind of caseload and the core areas of spend. Obviously, we know EHCP numbers have been growing over time. The spend has been growing over time. and the average cost has been moving up, but actually what you can see from the average cost is that it hasn't been going up significantly over the last 3 years. It's been pretty kind of minimal given the inflationary elements in the system. They were looking again at where we spend the money, and you can see actually the biggest chunk of spending is currently on specialist provision. So we have got quite a significant specialist provision spend. Independent is the second highest area of spend. Actually, what they did say in comparison to other LAs, some of the LAs that they're working with more significant financial issues than us, they would see independent on the other side of that graph, in front of the maintained special. So there is very, very clearly a kind of a pressure across the system around that use of independent. Ours is second on that kind of area of spend at the moment, but actually for many LAs it's moving in the wrong direction, and actually it's something we might see over the coming years unless we can get more special school places into the system. And then mainstream, post-16 and FE, and then there's the other areas of support. But they were looking to identify broadly where's our biggest area of spend. Wendy, I can see your hand's going up.
Yeah, Phil, just about this, the special schools and the independent, and looking back from what you've said, the 71 places that are increasing, especially the new special school in Stroud, that's a primary school. What are the kind of financial plans for when they become secondary age? Because at the moment there's nowhere for them to go.
Well, the plans, you're ahead of me, but yeah, the plans were to bid for 2 free schools for 400 places. We were unsuccessful in that, and we have fed back around that process, and actually it's something I've been pushing the F40 quite hard about, because it does feel an unsatisfactory process in the sense that you go into this bidding process that in effect delays you. We decided not to build our own special schools and invest our own capital funding into it because there was this opportunity to bid for central capital funding, as you would expect. We're trying to access that funding that's available. That's kind of delayed us by about 12 months, and actually the message back was both bids were approvable, but you weren't the highest level of need, because over the last couple of years we've put over 200 places into the system. We've built the Brook, we've expanded a number of special schools over a period of time. We've put quite a significant number of places in, and the message therefore becomes, to win a free school you have to not build and keep up with your sufficiency of special school places, or be the worst at it effectively to be successful, and that doesn't really feel entirely satisfactory.
But this could have an implication on the independent schools, because when those youngsters get to year 6 and they've not got a secondary place to go to because all the other special schools are full, you're then looking at independent provision.
We are now with the build of or progressing with the plans to try and move one of those schools forward ourselves. So the 400 places, the 200 place schools that we bid for, we are hoping that if we can get all of the approvals and everything through, we can get that done and open for January 2026, I think is the estimated timeline.
I know I keep going on about it, Phil, but it's kind of, from the special school head's point of view, it is actually really quite concerning, because we haven't got the space for those children.
Yeah, and it's understood, and we are then obviously having to use independent. So there is a plan to try and put those 200 places in through that school, and then we are looking at options to try and redress the rest of that gap, because the 400 places we needed are still 400 places we know we need. It's actually, how do we ascertain or identify and access the capital to be able to progress that, because building a 200 place school is not a cheap exercise. You're talking significantly more capital funding than we've got available at this moment in time. So we are looking to try and do that as part of the plan. Certainly the first 200 places is something that is progressing as quickly as it can at our end now. I think I've included these as well. I mean, they were in the report. What this was kind of looking at was the number of children and young people supported by the different provision types and the growth in that. You can see the independent on the left hand side there. The independent has been slowly rising. It's not been as sharp as some LAs. The message back to us was that we were performing relatively well in that landscape at the moment, but that other LAs had been doing the same and had seen in future years sharper increases. And I guess that is something we have to remain vigilant around, and it comes back to that point that Wendy was just making about getting more specialist placements into the system. The sharper rise there have been in mainstream, and obviously that's where the bulk of requests are coming from as a consequence. The average cost, again, none of these were areas of concern, so this was them deviling down into what we're doing to say, is there anything in any of the data, any of this analysis that we think is a significant concern. Average cost, again, wasn't a significant the growth cost around average, or the growth around average cost wasn't a significant concern for them. Which brought them back to this kind of, at the end of it, this idea of trying to forecast based on what we provided, and it's the right-hand graph there, what this looks like over time if we don't mitigate that. And that's a pretty scary chart. The projected expenditure, they're heading up towards 180 million, and the budget just over 105-ish by 2028. So the gap there is quite significant. There was another graph of further iteration of this, which I'll share in a second. So that kind of that first module was really trying to unpick and understand our data and make sure that we got their view of all of that. They were then looking through a number of exercises to try and delve down into that into more detail, so deep dives. The starting point was a number of case reviews, so there were 35 case reviews, which involved practitioners from across the system, healthcare, schools, at different parts of the system. They are obviously our education services, etc., education psychology, etc. And it was looking back at 35 cases to say around it with children with EHCPs as to what might have happened to potentially improve the outcomes for that child or young person. Actually, was their journey through the system an ideal one? Could things have happened differently, etc.? I'll come back to that in a second. Following the kind of case reviews, there was a number of deep dive activities that was looking at specifically based on the output of the reviews, accessibility of support is what support should a child and young person be able to access without an EHCP, and are there gaps in availability for that? Service awareness, there was a survey that came out to schools. We only got 31 responses to that, but there was a survey that came out to schools to ask around kind of their awareness of the different services and support that was available in the system. Specifically, parental confidence was an issue when it came out of the case reviews. So parents effectively stating confidence in mainstream's ability to be able to meet need, and in many cases that wasn't necessarily a judgment on school as much as the support and resources that the school has available to them to be able to meet child's needs. And then that linked to the kind of fourth point about the school ability to be able to do that. And again, there was some survey details around all of that. Where we got to in the case reviews was broadly that the practitioners that were involved felt that 63% of the cases they reviewed, there was a non-ideal outcome, i.e. that a child or young person ended up in a provision that wasn't necessarily a provision that would have been best suited to meet their needs. And in some instances, there was a view that an EHCP shouldn't have been required to be able to meet that child's needs. There were a number of EHCPs there where there was that view came through. I'll come back to kind of where that came out in the end. What, in effect, they've then asked us to do is look at a number of opportunity areas based on the kind of outputs of all of this to set some targets And I mentioned that graph that I showed you earlier. You can see it again there on the right hand side. In effect, this is what, when they've worked with us, the green line is in effect what they think, the green and yellow lines are effectively what they think are target and stretch targets for us to be able to reduce expenditure in this area. So after all the work they've done, all the analysis, all the work they've done through case reviews, all these deep dives, they've got to a point and said, this is what we think. If we set a target around kind of reducing expenditure is where we might get to, is the green line. If we stretch that target, we get to the yellow line. Now, there is still a very big gap to the blue line on that graph. I think when I started talking about this, I said one of the real benefits to this program from our perspective is that kind of input into the long term. What this is telling the DFE, and it's not just from Gloucestershire, this is from 54 other local authorities, is that Newton and SIPFA have worked with all these local authorities. They reviewed what's going on in their local system, and they think they can make marginal differences to what is happening in this system. Actually, there is no panacea to fixing this. There has to be something more significant at a funding and policy level that affects change in this area. And that is what, and without getting my frustrated head on, that's what I would, and we've been pushing back and saying through the F40 group and through different channels to the DFE and to anybody that will listen. But actually, when it's us saying it, it doesn't seem to have landed. And I guess there might be a question of, well, of course, it's your funding and of course you want more. Actually, now what they've got is an evidence base of 54 local authorities where it's very, very clear that it isn't local authority mismanagement of these grants. There is a significant rise in need across the local systems nationally that isn't being supported by the rising level of funding, and actually something has to change at a policy and funding level. Because as you can see, they spent a lot of time with us, and like I said at the start, they've been really good. It's been a really intense, I have to say, but good process. They've worked really closely with us, and that's where we got to in terms of redressing potentially the issue over the period up to 2028. And as you can see, that will not be satisfactory. So that's kind of the bigger picture. What they identified, and this is going to sound a bit obvious. I'm not sure there's another way of putting it, but there were initially five areas here. The four that are shown, three of them really are predicated around this idea that if we are able to strengthen mainstream inclusion, strengthen the support that we're able to provide earlier, in effect, we can reduce the flow up the system of children with special educational needs. So supporting goals and aspirations of children without an EHCP was an opportunity they felt we could identify. Supporting children that are currently accessing a specialist provision. This was from the case reviews that there was a number of children with specialists that, with the right support, could have been able to access a mainstream education. And then there were those that were accessing mainstream that maintained special that could potentially have access to resource-based or SEN unit. The one that we took out was independent schools. But it's and partly because it is just a flow down. If we're able to affect the system lower down, effectively, the flow down from independent will come anyway. The final one there was around post-16 and FE, and that's why there's a separate kind of a view of what we might want to do about post-16 and FE. And we know from the system that from other local authorities who are slightly ahead of us on the curve on this, that post-16 and FE is a rising cost pressure for a number of local authorities. Not partly because obviously with the increase in the number of EHCPs in the mainstream, we'll see more flow into post-16, but also actually they're staying longer. The extension of the age range to 25, we are seeing young people staying with support in education through an EHCP into their 20s, 22, 23, and obviously is adding significant cost back into the system as well, that was never funded as part of the changes in the code of practice. Becky, I can see you've put your hand up.
Thank you. Can I just double check that what we're looking at here, a minute ago you showed a graph which showed we had more children with EHCPs in mainstream settings than other counties, yes?
Yeah.
And then you said that 63% have non-ideal outcomes, and also that the feedback from parents is that many children in mainstream settings with EHCPs are not, I can't remember the wording, but they weren't unhappy with it. So, but our target is to keep more children in mainstream settings with SEN. That whole thing makes no sense to me, unless we're doing something.
I think well, so I think the message that they would, and I guess collectively would be giving there, is that yes, currently in terms of other local authorities, we've got more children and young people accessing a mainstream education with an EHCP, but the case reviews and the work they did found that there were still children within specialist provision that, if support had been right earlier in their education, wouldn't have had to access a specialist provision. There is quite a lot of data behind all of that, and that's why I was very conscious, obviously, about timings and all of that. And maybe there is an opportunity. That's why I kind of advocating earlier. Maybe an opportunity to go through the full data set in detail, because it is quite it would be a full meeting all on its own to be able to do that. But yes, I fully understand where you're coming from. I think their view is that opportunity to strengthen and support mainstream is inclusion is something that's come from the work they've done in terms of the deep dives and the case reviews, etc. It's also what's in the SEND and AP improvement plan. It's also what's at the core of our SEND and inclusion strategy. So actually continuing to try and support that journey feels like the right thing to do. Whether materially we can deliver those kind of increases or not is a question that we would have to kind of explore in more detail, because obviously, like you say, we are already in that position. And I go back to what I was kind of saying earlier, which is that whilst all of this is happening, we do have to recognise that we're also massively underfunded. So we're in that position where we're trying to really push and squeeze this in a way. And it will come back to, the question about the 1 in 40. We would be able to significantly increase, if we were funded at the median level, we'd be able to significantly increase that investment in, and we wouldn't be concerned about the deficit rising. So I don't know whether I'm answering where you were going with that, but I can feel the question. Yeah, is that right?
No, I do understand. And I obviously don't want to get the meeting to drag on. I just feel right back at the beginning, you showed that graph with the child being at the centre of the decision, and we get to the towards the end of it, and it would seem that the strategy is to force more children to stream. And I'm not saying that more couldn't, but you then have to give more money and support to the mainstream schools, because clearly it's not working currently. So it just didn't, it felt wrong, the outcome. I understand why it's the outcome, but it doesn't feel right.
And when you link this entire discussion from the start all the way back to the conversation we had about maintained school budgets over the next 3 years, and then you say, oh, we want to strengthen mainstream inclusion, and you've got a series of heads around this table saying, well, actually, over the next couple of years, we think we're going to have to cut back, and actually it's going to be, I think it was Shakita that said, it's going to be child, stuff that affects the child. That's what we're talking. I'm assuming we're talking about pastoral and wider support, because you have to protect teachers in classrooms at the end of the day. And actually, the reality of the system at the moment is we've got a message around mainstream inclusion that's coming from the SEND and AP improvement plan, but there isn't a funding mechanism that's supporting that kind of push. And actually, we'd be advocating, as part of the work we're doing with the F40, is to advocate, say, actually, if you really do want that Send an AP, that Send an AP improvement plan to be delivered in the way that you're expecting it to be, you have to invest in the mainstream system, because you've been cutting it for 10 years, and it's now seeing real-time cuts again. You're not going to see that impact unless you do.
And you end up in the special schools, you end up with some very, very damaged young people when they have been failed, for want of a better word, in the mainstream system, and they end up being very expensive children. So it's, yeah, there's a lot to do. I can see that. I'll put my hand down and let the 5 other people with hands up speak.
I know you've triggered something.
Sorry.
It's right. Ross.
Okay, I think Ross is next.
Phil, I'm just thinking, really, I mean, you've already mentioned about how it's been identified that getting that early intervention in can make the difference to children, and hopefully they can then go on to access mainstream. Was early years data for under 5s included in this work that you've done with Newton?
Yeah, so early years they had all the early years data as well, and actually part of what we're advocating around the idea of a kind of Send and Inclusion some kind of improvement program to work with settings would include early years. We want to include early years in that piece of work,
because very often we're the first sort of people who are working with children and families and identifying these areas of need, and at the moment it's particularly challenging because, you know, as we are all experiencing, the level of need is going up and the numbers are increasing year on year.
Yes, there was some stark data released yesterday. I think I certainly shared yesterday from the Early Years Alliance around EHCP growth in early years.
Yeah. And things like you're saying we've got fewer EHCPs than other places. I know that there's a significant delay in the processing of EHCPs. So how accurate is our data?
So that included all those that were in the process. Okay. And actually, I know there is a delay here, but there is a delay in most local authorities, and actually our processing is significantly better than some of those other local authorities we were working with in the DVV program. So whilst there is a delay here, that isn't, I hesitate to have to say, it isn't unusual, unfortunately. Right. So it's reflected across the system.
And also access to services. I mean, everybody's EP's got ATS, everybody's got a delay, so that the pool of resources and advice is just shrinking, it seems, for us.
Okay, thank you. Dermot? You might be on mute. Oh.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry for my delay, just struggling to get to the mic. Really good piece of work, and the slide that you got up is good because it's talking about opportunity. You know, the first one, goals to sort that, and it's interesting that's hitting on the 2.2, which we know is going to be an impact with the change from 140 to 130. The bit that I find interesting is when you look at data, and if you were saying, Phil, weren't you, that mainstream for us as an authority is considered to be a good provision for meet and need and more of it. However, in mainstream, if you look at it in terms of attendance, it's not. And attendance across the board for us all in mainstream is a challenge. So we're just keeping our heads above the national at the moment. But when you look at EHCP, nationally, students that, because this is like, if we're thinking, right, here's the money, mainstream setting, and this fits, doesn't it, where you're looking to support the goals and in a mainstream setting.
Yeah.
We do need a backing, because one solution is, where I know it's weaker, is from local authority, from government, is on the expectation and accountability of families to ensure that their children are safe, ensure that they make progress, ensure that their needs are met. They have to be in school. And currently, we got shocking figures where you'd look at, on a national level, 82% is the attendance, or 83% rounded up, is the attendance for EHCP students, okay, across the country. So now my academy, okay, currently we're on for EHCP. We're 7.3 up on that. So we're doing a lot, and we've got a big challenge to make sure that all our students are getting into school across groups. Biggest challenge probably are more disadvantaged rather than the HCP. But if you look at the Southwest is 10%. So EHCP students, okay, in the Southwest, 10% down on what the national average is. So, you know, where it's 80, only 80% on all. If you were to take that in a year group, and this is using Fisher Family Trust data, all right, so it would be mainly mainstream settings. If you look at year 10, it's 19%. Okay, when I compare that with my school, all right, and where it is the difference, we're 90% up on the national because the national is 78%. So it's really concerning when you look how that goes down, and when you get to year 11 at the time they're doing the GCSEs, attendance of EHCP is 75%. So then if that's Southwest, I think, well, how's Gloucestershire compared to the Southwest? Well, the PA, persistent absenteeism, in Gloucestershire is at 20, well, last time it was nearly 30%, 29.2 Gloucestershire, 29.3 Southwest. So that's telling us that actually on some of the basic things that you could win on, you can get more value out. So if the students are in, they're going to do better and get more value for money. And then we are getting more value for money out of that funding that we're putting into schools to support SEN. I think, I don't know whether Newton looked at attendance as an implication or an issue. It's a great body of work, but there has to be granular detail of us self-evaluating ourselves and how well we're doing as a local authority for students on the HCPs and how we're supporting schools in terms of what we're trying to do with quite an overwhelming set of issues post-pandemic.
Yeah, no, understood. And obviously the attendance issues nationally have been quite significant post-COVID. They've not, I think there was an expectation that the dip that we're seeing post-COVID in terms of attendance would start to rise again, but that persistent absenteeism and the rate of attendance nationally certainly hasn't improved. They didn't look at attendance data in that level of detail, actually, I have to say, and that is definitely something I'm happy to take away and explore in a bit more detail. Maybe if we could have a conversation offline and see if there's something, Phil, specifically that we could do around a piece of work around that to explore that in more detail. I'm happy to do that.
It's a key factor for the disadvantaged groups, isn't it? So yeah, those that are disadvantaged and with SEN.
Understood. Yeah.
Thanks, Phil.
Yeah, no worries.
Thanks, Liz. Hi, Liz.
Yeah, mine I think will be quicker. So being in a special school, actually we're quite keen where we identify children who could cope in mainstream or do well in mainstream, better than cope in mainstream, that they can move into. I think we've seen a better transition for those moving into mainstream secondary from us as a special primary. I wonder, this is clearly at a strategic level, has it fed down into SEN to have a look at how we map this for trying to move children, say, from primary to primary? Because there's almost an initial outlay which makes it more expensive initially whilst you work through the transition, but longer term it then comes up as a saving, I would say, from what I've seen.
To support transition back from primary special into primary mainstream, that isn't something, there isn't a specific piece of work around that transition as such. We have been doing some work around general transition points, and that is something I can take away and have a conversation with the SEN team around whether that's something we could explore. And maybe, I mean, obviously as a primary special school, maybe it'd be good to be able to have a direct conversation and see if there's something we could do around that to pilot something with you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it would be, like I say, from what I've seen, only just working on it this year, it is more expensive initially when you look at the transition costs, but then longer term you do then get that saving. So yeah.
Oh, I totally understand that. Yeah.
And the only thing I would just flag based on Dermot's point, just because I have done a little bit of looking at the attendance, is just to be mindful of the type of need on the HCP, because on a different type of need, their absence rates will be different. I've looked at comparing different special schools, clearly when I've looked at attendance for us, and clearly a child with PMLD, compared to a child with SEMH or those groups, that attendance average tends to be quite different. So it's just having that almost granular level of it as well.
Yeah, I think that what data I'm, raising is mainstream. But I totally take the point. Yeah, I agree. I know what you're saying. It does need to be really granular to look at it.
Okay, thank you. And Anne, you've been very patient. You might be on mute.
I could get myself off mute, sorry.
No
So yeah, I just wanted to have a chance to introduce myself. So hi colleagues, I arrived in the meeting late. This is my first schools forum, but I'm the new Director for Children's Services. So I just wanted to say hello to you, but also to speak in support of all of your comments really at this. It is quite rightly, you're describing a perfect storm, aren't you? And a really complex problem we're standing in the middle of with scant tools at a local level, it feels, to really tackle the problem. It does require national policy change, doesn't it? And significant funding actually across the public sector, not least into schools, but that isn't likely to change until at least the other side of an election, is it? So, I think what we're talking about are incremental gains that might be achieved. So how might we be a bit more inclusive in our mainstreams? How do we get it right earlier? How do we create and innovate in our communities and across our schools? And I, don't roll your eyes at me too much. I know I'm speaking to a group of people who pull rabbits out of hats every single day. So I just wanted to step in really with you and just take up that offer from Phil to do that granular work and have a look at that data sitting behind it, and us to really get into a good debate about what are the things that we might, shift 100 things by 1% rather than, have the kind of identify the silver bullet. Wouldn't that be great? That would create that kind of 100% change elsewhere. So yeah, so hello, and I'm in it with you, and I'm up for the conversation about the granular detail. So thanks for that.
Okay, thank you very much, Anne. Thank you. Phil.
I've added this slide in just because it was a slide I put in front of the Newton team when we first started the program as part of as if you remember the structure of that program, the starting point was set up in about and review. In that initial setup stage, they asked us to kind of give a view of what we were seeing in our local system and what our priorities were. And this kind of slide was kind of what we were saying to them at the start. And what impact are we looking for? And actually, I've put it up because I think it does kind of reflect where we got to with them on the DBV as well. We do want to see a smaller proportion of children and young people needing to access statutory support through any HCP. Aligns with that opportunity area they've identified. The higher proportion of children and young people with the HCP accessing a mainstream education, smaller proportion needing to go to independent specialist provision. Some capacity in our specialist system was a kind of objective, because actually it's not good enough just to be kind of getting to the right level. We want to just create a little bit of headroom in the system if we can, and then obviously reduce exclusion, because EHC, again, when Dan was talking about attendance data, and another area of concern around SEN is exclusion rates. So an increase in outreach and partnership work from our AP was a kind of message there around that kind of strengthened or reduced level of exclusion. We kind of identified alongside that some of the challenges we saw, and again, this is still playing out in the system right now. You're talking about, and this is kind of me presenting back to them, you're talking about strengthening mainstream inclusion when the level of SEND is rising sharply in the system. There's more children needing access to support than there ever has been. Recruitment and retention in the education system is incredibly challenging in all parts of it. School budgets are under increasing pressure, and the accountability systems are still focused heavily on academic outcomes. And actually, it isn't. I guess my message back, it isn't a strong message around supporting inclusion when those things are effectively working against you. I've already flagged the fact the centralised capital programme is slow and not well resourced. You know, the message we're giving back at the moment is, and it might sound a bit glib, but drop the free school programme for a bit. And actually, if you're going to invest a significant amount of capital funding in specialist provision, devolve it to local authorities on the devolved capital formula that you use, because the reality is there isn't a local authority in the country at the moment that doesn't need more specialist provision. So actually, it would be more equitable to be able to support that funding across the country rather than to put it into what is quite a lengthy and slow process as well. Because actually, I mentioned we're aiming for January 2026. We'd be 12 months ahead of that if we hadn't waited for the free school programme, and that is a real challenge for us in the system. The system has evolved culturally. We are providing more in the system around what's wanted, and rather than what at times we feel is needed in terms of support. There's lots of pressure around that at the moment about what can be accessed, and actually the reality at the moment is the funding in the system isn't there to provide to the level of what's wanted at the moment. It just isn't, and that's why we're significantly overspending. And then obviously that risk that obviously all of this is so complex and reliant on so many different stakeholders that actually isn't as easy as flicking a switch. Now, some of these things are much easier. Building a special school is something that actually, and when we've been through the DBV programme, one of the things we've seen across the board is that most local authorities, when they talk about existing mitigations, their most effective existing mitigation on spent expenditure is to build special schools, because it's a thing that you can control, you can build, and actually when you put a specialist placement in, generally it will cost you about £25,000 to £30,000 less a year per place in a maintained specialist provision than it would in an independent placement. So there's an element of control around that, whereas lots of the other parts of the development of the system are very much focused on a range of different key stakeholders who aren't necessarily all of us on the same page. So we presented that back to them, and I think, in essence, the programme itself has given us a much richer evidence base. Like I said before, I'm really happy to kind of go through that and set up a session to go through it in much more detail, to share what was a kind of really rich set of slides and evidence around it. It's really helped inform the DFE policy around this, and I do think in some of the sessions we've had where they've been feeding back to policymakers, it does feel like this was a kind of something that they weren't expecting. They weren't expecting Newton not to be able to. They were fully of the view that Newton would be able to come in, create a plan with us that would see us back towards a balanced budget. And actually, I think they've been quite surprised by that process, and it has, I think, policy and funding. Like Anne said, I don't think we're likely to see any real significant changes around the policy side of it until the other side of a general election. The funding element, we are pushing towards an autumn statement that's going to come up probably towards the end of November. So I'll come back to that in a second. Some of the work we're doing on their 40. The final bit around the DBV was what we were proposing in there to kind of invest the grant funding in. And there were two areas to this. So the post-16 bit, which I think is an area that probably from the DBV programme wasn't one we'd spent a lot of time focused on to date. Actually, I think we knew that post-16 was going to become an issue, but it wasn't forefront. So actually, the fact that's been identified has been really useful. We are proposing to invest an element of that in the grant into some specialist commissioning support to help develop the post-16 marketplace. Again, at the moment, what we're seeing and what we will see is a growth of independent provision if we don't support the kind of growth of the FE and the kind of Gloucestershire SGS kind of part of the sector, but also to improve our engagement around advice and guidance much earlier for children with special educational needs, and the support specifically around the kind of year 9 period, to start to look at longer term outcomes and the kind of the projection forward. What is kind of destination going to look like? What does post 16 look like? What does employment look like? What does the move towards independence look like? And at the moment, because of the pressures on the casework and the teams we've got, there isn't enough focus at the right time on that. So there's that kind of focus on the post 16, and then there was the focus on the support around an SEND inclusion program, and the intention here was both to work with both early years and the mainstream sector around this, to look at how can we provide a stronger level of more intensive support to an organisation to affect change and to look at and review practice, but also to influence decisions around funding. We've talked a lot about the changes to the 1 in 40, and we'll come back to that at the next meeting in September, where there'll be some proposals about how we start to take that forward at a whole school level. Actually, the idea of having a kind of more structured SEND and inclusion program could enable us to look at how we then allocate additional funding to a school, to a setting, to support around the enhancement of provision. And that's not to say so enhancing it above and beyond what we might expect as a baseline. So that was the kind of starting point, and it was for us it was very much linked around kind of trying not to add significant additional work into the system. We're already doing quite a lot in this area. I've tried to show on the kind of on the graphic there a number of activities that are already underway. We're developing the inclusion baseline, which will be shaped into a self-evaluation tool. That is something we're looking at and should be available by September. It's been reviewed by schools. It's been through EP and ATS. We're just trying to get to the point where we can develop that into a self-evaluation tool. We want to improve the use of the graduated pathway. We want to improve our training office for workforce development, and there's a project underway to start to look at how we can do that in a more structured way. The improved funding models, which links to the 1 in 40 and the idea of kind of in non-statutory funding. AEP has been a priority. Special sufficiency, which we've already touched on, in building more special schools, strengthening the local offer, and then we are currently piloting something called the Navigation Hub with a number of schools. I don't know whether there are any schools involved here, but that is specifically a single point of access that the school can engage with around any children and young people that they've got concerns around access to education or any kind of support. So rather than approaching different agencies, that kind of idea of a single point where they can actually get a referral, triage and support directly from that single point. So there's quite a lot of activity already underway. I did put up on there as well that alongside all of that kind of development work, there has been the council's invested a significant amount in SEND casework, 1.6 million last year and another 800,000 on top of that this year, and that improvement in SEND casework will have material impact on our ability to at least meet deadlines and timelines, so I think somebody touched on earlier, but also to strengthen our review process, etc., and strengthen our relationship, I think, with parents and families, because when you're operating a caseload of 250, it is very hard to build that relationship. So strengthening casework. We have to develop the inclusion visits, which is part of the new attendance guidance, and the inclusion service are working on that at the moment. And we're also adapting the EP and ATS service to be more school facing. So they want to take less individual child referrals and work more holistically at school level. So there's a lot of activity going on. The kind of proposal that we're thinking is how can we shape a kind of a program that could support development of inclusive SEND practice across school provision over potentially a period of 12-18 months, and linking that into some of this activity is already going on. So the idea of having a self-evaluation up front, and I touched on this in paperwork, a core training offer that's available to the school throughout that process, whether that's around things like the graduated pathway, social, emotional, mental health, how you support children with ASD, whatever that, whether it's quality first teaching, whatever that training offer might look like, developing a training offer alongside the idea of kind of enhanced funding and supporting. So there's that kind of principle of developing something in that landscape, both at an early years and a school level. Interested to hear any thoughts or feedback around any of that in terms of the proposed approach. Okay.
Is there no questions? Could I?
Go on.
Sorry?
Sorry, go on. Sorry, my fault.
Okay. There are two recommendations or two statements there that four members are asked to support. Can I ask whether there is anybody in the meeting who would not support that application for grant funding? So therefore we can take it the school forum does support such an application. Okay. And also, before we move on to F40, I need to apologise. I skipped over a recommendation a long time ago. It's on page 16, and it's about the DSG deficit. It's on page 16 of the papers, and it's that one just there, which is that that's right, which is that the forum agrees the DSG deficit is earmarked as shown above. In other words, that the dedelegated surplus and the early years surplus are effectively carried forward, and also the deficit. So is there anybody who would not want to support that recommendation? Okay, again, apologies for missing that at the time, but thank you very much. So again, we can take it the school forum does support that recommendation. Phil, we're going to move on to F40 now.
Yeah, I'll just give a quick update. So the F40, for those that don't know, is a group that's focused around supporting changes and recommendations around policy changes around education funding. It's chaired by a councillor from Derbyshire. I'm currently one of the deputy chairs for the executive group, and there are two vice chairs who are both councillors as well. So Gary Streeter is the vice chair, the Conservative vice chair, and Emma Hardy is the Labour vice chair of the group. It is focused on trying to, and has been historically focused on the equity of funding issue, and this was around school funding. And this is a graph that you'll have seen from them probably before. I've circulated some of their most recent papers today, or I say I have. You'll have received them from Joe. They came out yesterday. This is the updated documentation. This would be included. It effectively shows where the F40 members sit in terms of average per pupil funding. So this is the DSG allocation per mainstream pupil for school funding. And obviously there's a London effect on this right-hand side where it climbs up. But F40 members, as you can see, are on this this side, and we're somewhere in the middle of that group of F40 members, effectively as a local authority. So there's that focus on funding around and fairer funding from a kind of DSG level. They are also and have developed an adjusted national funding formula model, which in effect in itself is basically trying to promote fairer funding as well, is basically saying that all of the deprivation factors and all of the additional needs factors that are in the current national funding formula should sit above the minimum per pupil funding level. So schools should get a minimum per pupil funding that funds education, and then additional needs factors sit on top of that. And that's something they've been pushing and lobbying for change for quite some time. I've put the second one on because this is their high needs. You'll have seen my versions of these earlier. This is their high needs one. You don't need to read all the names, but in effect, what I was trying to kind of show on this is actually when you look at the way that inequity of funding is happening in the system, these are F40 members. The majority of those members, which are all on the left in terms of per pupil for mainstream funding, are also all on the left in terms of high needs funding. There are a few outliers there, You won't be surprised to know that Buckinghamshire are one of those, because I keep going on about them, but they're on the right hand side of that chart. They're the furthest orange line across. But actually what you can see is that inequity in the system that's in the funding system at the moment is playing out in both a schools level and a high needs level. Just to update on activity, so there was supposed to be yesterday an MP's briefing in the House. It was cancelled at the last minute because somebody very inconveniently decided there was going to be a lot of voting yesterday evening from 4:25 through to 8 o'clock. I think it was the immigration bill that was going through, and in effect they had to cancel the briefing for MPs. So we were prepared to do a full briefing to them on fairer funding and the issues around SEND. That's being reorganised for September now. That's sponsored by Gary Streeter and Emma Hardy, and also Robin Walker has been supporting it as well, as former chair of the Education Select Committee. So there's activity there around trying to get in front of policy makers to kind of affect this. We've written recently to Gillian Keegan, about to write to we haven't had a positive response yet there. We've written to or about to write to Claire Coutinho as well to try and get some interest from that side of the kind of ministerial team, and writing to the Chancellor at the moment around the high needs issues specifically. And you'll see in the papers that I sent across, there is a kind of summary of what they perceive to be the kind of core high needs issues, and there is an ask in there of 4.6 billion, which we know is unrealistic, but it is actually the figure that has been. So the kind of funding team at F40 have looked at kind of inflationary costs and changes over time, and in effect that's what they perceive to be the required gap in high needs to address the kind of current issues around it. So all of that's gone out. There is also a meeting set up with Shadow Education team that's going to happen in October, and a meeting with the funding policy team and the SEN teams from the DFE in the new academic year as well. All of this now is formed a bit around a collaboration group as well. I think if you remember, historically there was some pressure around increasing school funding, and there was a collective ask for about 14 billion that the unions were pushing, and a number of different organisations were pushing. That collaboration group has reformed. So the unions, the County Councillors Network, the Society of County Treasurers, the F40, etc., a number of groups, all kind of coalescing around what are the current funding issues and actually what is the ask of the system, and that's all being pushed out, trying to get ahead of the decisions around the autumn statement, but also trying to get presence in manifestos as we move towards an election. So when I mentioned it a minute ago, actually this does need funding and policy change at top level. We're doing everything we can, I think, through that group to lobby and push and get some of the right messages across into the system. We are obviously in a landscape of, there are lots of parts of the public sector that are screaming for money. There's health, there's social care, there's the system isn't well funded anywhere, but we are making our presence as felt as we possibly can around these issues. I think as we go through this process, if there's anything that schools feel that they can do or add to any of that process, then we'd obviously welcome that. Sarah.
I just wanted to state the obvious, and you'll all be aware that the National Education Union's recent strike action since February, and obviously apologies for the disruption that's caused in your schools, but the basis of that is around fairer funding. When we've been marching and we've had rallies in Gloucester and in Bristol and London, and we've been writing to our MPs and lobbying MPs and communicating with the Department for Education, Gillian Keegan, etc., it's all been around fair funding. So you mentioned unions, but the National Education Union and today the NASUWT, the other main teaching union, has also they've reached the threshold for strike action. We all hope we don't have to continue that action into the autumn, but we are there alongside you and local authorities campaigning for and demanding better funding for schools. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. The only other thing I should have mentioned, which I didn't actually, just around the SEN issue, the high needs issue, is that the group is working with the senior MP to try and get a debate on the House floor around SEN as well. So there is lots of activity trying to influence and raise awareness, if you like, around the kind of high needs and SEN pressures in the system. I just wanted to kind of finish on that one from my perspective. I know Joe needs to talk to the Constitution, and we're probably on a little bit on time, so I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Phil. Are there any other questions for Phil about his report back from F40? Okay, sorry, F40 seemed to follow on naturally from agenda item 7. So if we can just go back to agenda item 8, which is about the annual review of the Schools Forum Constitution and membership structure. Obviously, you had the papers, which included the membership structure and the Constitution. Are there any issues from that you would want to discuss or you'd like to raise?
So as I understand it, Joe, there are no proposed changes. That's correct, right?
Yeah, that's correct. No proposed changes.
No.
Yeah.
So if there are no points that any members wish to raise, then presumably the Constitution and the membership structure can continue as it is until the next review in a year's time.
Yep, that's right, Andrew.
Okay. Okay. Well, there are no points being raised, so therefore, as I say, we can take that as continuing in its current form. Thank you very much. We are at 2 minutes past 4, so we just overrun. Thank you very much for your time, and this is the last meeting for summer break, so I hope you have wonderful summer holidays, and look forward to discussing education-related matters and finance and so on with you again in the new academic year. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks, Phil.
Bye.
Thank you.
Phil and Joe, can I ask you a very quick question before everybody disappears?
You can do. I've stopped the live feed, Sarah, but
No, that's fine. It's about September's meeting and about writing the facilities report. So I will aim to do that next week, because that's always facilities funding is always discussed in September meeting, and I've had Tony Chong from the NAS his figures. So is that all right with you if I'll try and get that sent to you the end of next week, but if not, the beginning of September? Does that fit in with you, Joe?